Thank you, Sivan, and thank you, Joe. We don't really have much time. We'll take one or two questions, and then maybe Joe also wants to respond to some of Sivan's comments.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Questions? Yes, please.
With the development of travel towards with the development of travel towards the Holy Land as part of the Orient, mostly in the 18th, 19th century, have you found any descriptions of eroticism in the travel logs, or even more so in the travel guides, early Baedeker and other travel guides that sort of insinuate or hint that part of the package could be that kind of tourism, knowing that the motivation for those who come to the Holy Land probably was different than those who went to Egypt and the Ottoman Empire because they were more Christian oriented.
Yeah, I've actually looked in some of those sources, definitely not in the Baedekers. And although, you know, it's amazing what can find its way into travel guides, as your work on Berlin is going to show you. It's actually sometimes there. And I haven't found it in specifically Holy Land directed travel narratives. There have been, there are sometimes the Holy Land is one of many stops, and in those narratives you can have the sort of homoerotic popping up in various contexts, which is not to say there isn't a history of homoeroticism in the sort of Ottoman Palestine that you get through various legal documents, historical documents and stuff. That said, you have curious overlaps. Leonard and Landrock, two German and Swiss photographers who set up a studio first in Cairo and then in Tunis, produced pictures for people who weren't going to ever be tourists themselves. And so there was one of their anything to make money out of their photographs. And they would do like architectural ruins. They did pictures of the Holy Land. They also had, you know, pictures of heterosexual sort of semi-porn. And then they had pictures of nubile youth stripped. So they're working all those markets at once. So there are congruences. Same with the, you know, there are a couple of travel logs, and these are not to the Holy Land, but it's by reverends on Christian missions to other. I think it is Turkey, but I can't be 100%. Who do find themselves entranced. Their narratives, at least, seem overly invested in describing certain young man stripped down doing the water pump or whatever. Again, you know, you always have to be careful, and this is like your outside readers, you know, like. Well, you know, this is local custom to be naked while you're pulling up the water thing in Egypt. So maybe any Westerner would take his time or her time to comment on it. But then again, how it's described can also be a clue to perhaps a kind of investment. And it's too easy sometimes to write off things as, oh, that's not important, just like people who would say, those guys are just lounging in their chairs, all adolescents turned to the side or whatever. Or no, what you were showing so clearly following the aesthetic of homoeroticized youth in the miniatures tradition. So clearly from what you show. But sort of the normal person looking at those would not pick that up unless you know the heritage here. It was a long-winded non-answer, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, Ofri.
Thank you for your talk. Talking about the contrapunct, as you described it.
We know that since Winkelmann in the 18th century until Oscar Wilde, we have this ideal of the Greek love, of Greek homoeroticism in Europe. So I wonder how is the Greek ideal of homoeroticism positioned against the Oriental image of the homoerotic Orient or something of this kind?
A very, very good and interesting and very complex question. For someone like Lord Byron in his private letters, where this doesn't make it into any of his literary work, but where part of his mission in going to Albania was clearly to experience homoerotic pleasures with youth. And the court of, I forget the name of the Pasha, but where he's bringing a whole Greek Hellenistic sort of mindset and terminology to what then he wants to find. You also have, I think, very clear traces in many Persian and Ottoman documents of a knowledge of Plato and the symposium and its sort of configurations of male desire being rewritten and sort of proverb-like ways that are recalibrated to the Ottoman context. So that's like a clear path back to a sort of a Greek notion. Now what's fascinating is, and this is an example of how the idea of male homoerotic activity can be used as sort of always used as a weapon to demonize the other. There are the Persians who will say, oh, the Greeks started it. There'll be the Greeks who say, no, no, I think this is in Thucydides, who says, oh, no, 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 it came from Persia. So it's always the it, that's being deferred off onto the other camp. So there are connections. I actually do think there are major differences between the institutionalization of pederasty to the extent it existed in aristocratic Athens, between citizens and youths who would then become citizens, and the various dynamics that you would get, say, in the Ottoman court, where almost everyone serving in the court is on some level a slave that's come from territories outside, who rises through the ranks. You can be a great slave in the empire, depending on the job that you rise to. And then you can own your other slaves, etc. But nonetheless, and this gets into the difference of power differentials that are so complicated. But those create relationships that aren't quite like the ones in that Greek pederastic sort of milieu. Power is differently configured. And I think the actual acts of sexuality that take place are quite different, where, I mean, it's arguable, but a lot of the stuff I've written about Greek pederasty is there was all intracrural, meaning that you didn't have actual anal intercourse, whereas that is part of the desired fantasy among many of Middle Eastern man who has a beloved. But what I do show in my book, and this will allow me to begin to address some of your questions, is that I entered the project thinking, okay, what's called the Mediterranean model of sodomy, which is a culture in which if sexuality happens between men, it's because you can sort of substitute one man, the younger one, the prettier one, into the female position, the bottom, the recipient, and the act of intercourse, and that sort of makes it okay because it means the top. The man could be a man whether he's having sex with a woman or a younger boy. It's just a substitute for a woman. And I sort of entered thinking, well, maybe that is, what's going on here. But that became so complicated and such an oversimplification in my look at the evidence, where it's clear there are relationships between adolescents and adolescents. There are relationships between men and men. There are actually beard-loving. There are poems written to the praise of the beard instead of it's being a marker of what's no longer desirable in a beloved. So you have, the wrestler whose boyfriend is a soldier kind of thing. So that sort of breaks that stereotype. Now that said, and this is where I know the Ottoman and Arabic sort of literature better than the Persian, and I think the Persian sort of development of male-male relationships follows a slightly different path that is much more literally pederastic. Age can range in any of these situations from, what is, frankly pedophilic, but that seems a minority to me, to the adolescent whose adolescence may well extend into his 20s in a lot of these texts. But in a lot, particularly the latter 19th century accounts that I've read of Persian nobles and all with their minions, and there was the one Shah, who was
Nasruddin
notorious.
Shah with Malijak.
Yeah, who's all of his minions are boys. It seems like that was a more acceptable and more prevalent, perhaps, way that the male-male relationship is being expressed in Iran, or Persia becoming Iran during this period, than in some of the other areas. That's my supposition there. But you're very right to raise the question of power relations as they pertain to age. At the same time, it's keeping the double vision, the two eyes, the bifocals, realizing that we bring our own constructed notions of what is adolescence, what is childhood, to culturally specific situations that may differ. For instance, in Morocco, a Rifian boy from the mountains has come to earn his way in the city at 8. Up till the 1940s, was considered an adult. So what he does for his profession is professional in a kind of way. That, goes absolutely counter to our sense of what's permissible within sexual congress. But just one example. Another that I find really interesting and sort of admonitory in the assumptions we sometimes like to make has to do with the photographers Leonard and Landrock I was talking about, where I've read one correspondence where there's this overly eager European customer who's been buying all these sort of pictures of youth, saying, "Oh, I really like that one. I want more pictures of him. And how old is he? He looks so young," kind of thing. So it sounds, this is definitely a pedophilic sort of correspondence. And not affronted, but very matter-of-factory, it's Leonard writing the letter, writes back saying, "Well, actually, that's one of my most reliable models. He's 16, but as with all Middle Easterners, he shaves his pubic hair. Therefore, he appears younger." So again, see the sleight of hand where you might be reading something as a visual image is entirely, pedophilic, and it turns out, well, that is an adolescent, and so it's trying to learn to negotiate things like that. It's impossible. But if we keep pressing against all the questions there, we at least get a bigger picture than we had before. Are there other sort of points that...
One last point, and we'll end on this point of pornography. Sivan wants to know about pornography.
It's funny because on one hand, my way of dealing with...
Let me just say that there is a long chapter in the book.
It's really quite short. It's one section. You see, this is how projection happens. But
by the way, make sure your office door is closed when you read the book.
No, there are some. Some of the pornographic images are from the miniaturist tradition, and I think you're absolutely right. Pornography serves the functions of fantasy. How much can it tell us about real practices? Yeah. How much can any literature tell us about real practices? It itself is a textual remnant that we have to read as a representation. That's one answer. Now, on the other hand, what is interesting is that, there are some images, I think there's some, in the porn section, I forget his name, he's the person who does sketches, and they're quite explicit. And I needed to show them, but I did cut out a lot of the images myself because I felt, okay, I'll just focus on the part of the whole orgy scene that you need to see, not the whole thing. Because there is the danger of, you don't want to titillate for the sake of titillation. I want to be taken as a serious scholar, and in general, I handle that. I try to handle that, and the presentation. But if I'm talking about a penis, I'm talking about a penis. So instead of trying to, sort of find euphemisms or dance around subject matters. On the other hand, there were images you told me not to show tonight. so you can
stay later.
But that was all. That was all so that you would buy the book.
So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Sivan. Thank all of you for being here and staying.
Thank you for coming.